Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. As you know, the entire world is going through a calamity, and we need to contain our activities to control the spread of coronavirus. At the same time, it is equally important to maintain the academic activities by using other available mean of communication. Therefore, I have planned to record remaining lectures as video. You can ask your questions on Google Classroom and we will arrange the response. So today we are going to cover lecture number 11. So that I will not be able to give you the complete deliver the complete lecture number 11 because the software that I'm using does not support to hold such big file. So I will make small segments of lecture number 11 and upcoming lectures. So today I will cover the concept of interrupt. So what is an interrupt? By definition, interrupt has two versions. The first version is belongs to our day-to-day life. Suppose you are deeply involved in writing your assignment, solving a complex math problem, reading a book, and any of your family member um, shouts and seeks your help in finding item. Suppose, so what you will do, you will, number one, suspend the current activity, the ongoing activity of writing assignment, reading book. Number two, you will store the current activity status in some place. Maybe if you're watching the movie, you will pause that movie, and if you're writing your assignment, you will place your assignments, your belongings in some secure place, and then you will get the new job. The person who is seeking your help, you will get the job from him. And number four, you will complete the job. And number five, you resume your old activity. I mean the video file that you was watching before earlier, you will play the file again. So this entire process that you have just gone through with is called as interrupt. That you was doing some of your work, and another person who is in a critical state, and he seeks your help. So you suspend your current activity and help him, and later on resume your activity. So this entire process is called as interrupt. So in CPU, as we know that the CPU is a the central resource, and it manages all over overall activities of your system. So the CPU is connected, need to control the peripheral devices. The CPU need to manage the RAM, need to run the various operating system routines. So the CPU is a single resource, and it must provides its processing capabilities to the entire system, like peripheral devices like keyboard, mouse, the hard disk, and the RAM, and operating system itself also needs CPU. So in all time, the question is now, the question is, what is meant by the CPU time? The CPU time means that the CPU is continually generating the cycles, as we have discussed in the previous class, the concept of oscillations, that CPU is continually generating its cycles, and within each cycle a unit of work is done, if you remember in the earlier classes. So within each cycle a unit of work is done by any program. So now the CPU time means that the cycles your CPU was generating, its allocation. The CPU time means the allocation of CPU cycles to the resources available within your PC. Now this other question that rises here is that how to allocate the CPU time, how to allocate CPU cycles. So in old times, whenever any process needs the CPU, in old times the CPU take this responsibility to check which which resource needs the CPU, meaning that the CPU continually seeking the peripheral devices, seeking the operating system routines, seeking the software, and check whether they need the CPU cycles or not, whether they need CPU time or not. And in this case, if they need, so CPU allocates its time. So in this case, this technique is not good, because the CPU, when checks which resource needs his time, also waits its cycles. The checking process, the CPU is checking that which resource needs its cycles. It also needs it's also processing. So CPU also waits its own cycles just to check which resource needs its time. So this is not a good technique. So engineers come up with the new idea. Why they come up with new idea? Because in current era that we're going through with, we have a bulky softwares, application softwares, we have bulky operating systems, we have huge number of peripheral devices connected with our PC. So it is not viable to actually make your CPU, design your CPU in a way in which your CPU is checking which peripheral devices, which resource needs its time. So this technique is not good. So the engineers come up with a new idea, and they propose that instead of CPU checking, we can make a device so intelligent that when it needs to acquire the CPU time, it generates a signal. It informs the CPU that I need your time. So this technique, nowadays this technique is used by most of the in fact in the entire CPU designing system. This technique exists. The old technique that I was discussing with you is called as pulling method. So the problem is that with pulling method is that it needs to acquire the CPU need to waste its own cycles to check which resource needs the CPU time. So this is the interrupt. Now we start reading the literature definition of interrupt. What are the definitions of the interrupts? They are available in the literature or in the books. The first definition is: an interrupt is a signal to the processor emitted by hardware or software. It is a signal. Who generates this signal? Either a hardware can generate this signal or a software can generate this signal. And what is meant by generation of the signal? It indicates an event that needs immediate attention. I mean, an interrupt is a signal and it is generated towards the processor. It is heading towards the processor, and when it is generated, it means that something is happening and it needs a CPU time. It needs attention. This is definition number one. Definition number two is: an interrupt is a signal sent to the processor. An interrupt is a signal sent to the processor that interrupts the current process. Now, definition number two states that the processor is doing its job. It's executing a process, and another process which was running behind, it needs is the attention of CPU. It needs the CPU time. So it will interrupt the ongoing process. It will inform the processor that interrupt the ongoing process, and CPU definitely will interrupt and then allocate its time to the new process. So this is the definition number two, that interrupt is also cause interrupt. Whenever interrupt occurs, it cause interrupt towards which the processor was doing another activity, and the new interrupt overlaps the old interrupt. The third definition is the suspension of a process. The CPU is doing some job, doing some processing. So interrupt is the suspension of that process. You suspend that process, and the process that you suspend, later on you resume it. Your processor resume it. So this is the definition number third. So what are the classification of interrupts? Interrupts are classified broadly into two categories. The first kind is hardware interrupt, and the second one is software interrupt. What is hardware interrupt? This interrupt is purely generated by the hardware. For example, when you move your mouse generates an interrupt. When you press a key on your keyboard, it generates an interrupt. So these are the broad definitions that you can understand. Otherwise, the hard disks that are present within your CPU also generates an interrupt, and it's a hardware. But these are the commonly understandable interrupts that are more you know easily understandable to you. The keyboard, when you press any key on the keyboard, it generates an interrupt. When you move your mouse, it generates an interrupt. So this interrupt is called as hardware because these interrupts are generated by the tangible objects. So hardware interrupts are of two types: the maskable interrupt and non-maskable interrupt. Maskable interrupt are the interrupts that the processor can delay. I mean, an interrupt occurs, interrupt occurs, and the interrupt was seeking CPU time, and the CPU looked at the interrupt, and the CPU decides that this interrupt is of no importance. If I delay it, it will not harm the system resources. So CPU can continue completing the allocated job and later on resume it as per his own availability. So this is called as maskable interrupt, that you can delay, your processor can delay it. The second one is non-maskable interrupt. These are the hardware interrupts that you cannot delay. I mean, you must execute it at any cost. You have to execute it. For example, you can take the maskable interrupt and non-maskable interrupt as it is. Suppose you are working in PowerPoint, and immediately the PowerPoint stops working. You are doing some writing, making some assignment, and you are using PowerPoint, and immediately PowerPoint stops responding. So this interrupt is maskable, meaning that at the same time your processor, you can execute other applications. Only PowerPoint is halted. It will not harm the execution of other jobs. So the second example you can take, that your window is halted. If your window is halted in a hard state, then this is the major interrupt, and you have to solve it. You have to restart your PC. So you cannot mask this interrupt. This is called as non-maskable interrupt. So the second classification is the software interrupt. The interrupt that are generated by the system software. The system software or the application software. These are the interrupts that are generated by the softwares. In simplest terms, software mean your program. An interrupt is generated by your program, your own program in execution. When it generates some interrupt, it is called a software interrupt. Why it is called software? Because it is untangible. You cannot touch it like the hardware. You can touch it, you can feel it. The software interrupt is a non-tangible interrupt. So there are two classification of software interrupts. The first is normal interrupt, and the second one is exception. What is meant by the normal interrupt? Sometimes you write your program and you cause an interrupt to occur, and that interrupt is a part of instruction in your program. It is called as normal interrupt. Now, for example, if you have designed antivirus, and within antivirus at some stage you want to restart the PC. So restarting the PC is a normal operation of your program. You have written an instruction to restart your PC. So this is called as normal interrupt. That the interrupt that you are causing is a part of instruction, is a written instruction in your program. This is called as normal interrupt. The second one is exception. Exceptions are unplanned interrupts. That these interrupts are the interrupts that you was not that were not part of your instruction. It was not a part of your instruction. It was not part of your program, and it happens during the execution of your program. For example, you may have seen this interrupt so many times, called as the runtime divided by 0. So this is the very common unplanned example of interrupt, divided by 0. So the next is the interrupt examples. So you can see the interrupt examples are program based interrupts like stack overflow. I'm hopeful that you may have seen this error. This is also an interrupt caused by the program and divided by 0. The second one interrupt class example is timer. So in multitasking, when you have to do multiple tasks at the same time, your CPU allocates its time to each job. Suppose you have 10 jobs and the CPU want to execute all jobs simultaneously. So CPU allocates its time. Job number 1 may be 10 seconds, job number 2 10 seconds, job number 3 10 seconds. So this is called as timer, that your CPU is giving it to the various jobs. So when the timer expires for job number 1, CPU generates an interrupt. This is called as timer interrupt. What is the purpose of this interrupt? To take the CPU processor cycles, to take the processing cycles and allocate it to the next job. Right? To take the processing cycles and allocate them to the next job. So this is called as timer based interrupts. The third one is IO interrupts. IO interrupts, as we have discussed in the classroom, the input output controllers in the previous classes, as we know that the entire input output devices are connected with the controller and it is called as input output controller, IO controller. So these are the interrupts that are caused by the IO controller. Right? These interrupts are caused by the input output controller. Suppose your keyboard, when it generates an interrupt, it generates via IO controller. This is called as the input output controller interrupts. And the next classification is hardware failure. Sometime, suppose your CPU, your mouse stop working, or your hard disk stop doing its operation, or your RAM stops doing its operation. So this is called as a hardware interrupt. So what is meant by the hardware interrupt? Hardware failure. What is meant by the hardware failure? The resource within your CPU stop working. This is called as hardware failure. So these are the examples of the interrupt. So for now, I'm just I have just prepared these few slides to give you. In the next upcoming classes, inshallah, I will arrange more of these kind of segments of lectures. So up till next time, good luck and keep yourself secure and keep yourself secure. Good luck. Ask your question. If you have any question, you can ask your questions on the Google Classroom. Okay, thank you. Allah Hafiz.